Last weekend, I won the Unland Cup. People asked me to make a video talking about the deck that I played. I did it with a pretty unique spirits deck. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I chose to play this deck, the cards that I chose to play in the deck, and some tips and tricks for playing the deck. So let's get to it. I chose to play this deck for two reasons. The first is I think air is an incredibly powerful position in Sorcery. It has sites that give it mana boosts. It has undercosted creatures. It has the best card draw, and it has the most tutors. The other reason that I'm playing this deck is that I saw in the Courtesan Cup last year a spirit-based deck that used a Nimbus Jinn combo finish and also a Ghost Ship with Evil Presence to recur other ghost ships or spirits. It looked really cool, but it didn't look like it was ready for prime time. With the release of Arthurian Legends, additional spirits were printed, and I thought that might push the archetype over the top. I wanted to invest more time in it and started working on it last December. Let's get into the card choices. The most important card in the deck is Evil Presence. Evil Presence lets you spend 2 mana to put down an aura, and you can summon a spirit on the location of that aura, and it gets charged, and then the aura returns to your hand. It essentially transforms all of your undercosted high-power spirits into unpredictable, brutally effective killing machines. A trick with Evil Presence is if you think your opponent could have a Dispel, especially if they're an Archimago, you hold the Evil Presence in your hand, and then when you're ready to cast your minion, you pay the Evil Presence and then play the minion, and then the Evil Presence returns to your hand, so it's safe in your hand most of the time. Along with this strategy, Torhammer Trinket goes with Evil Presence as the main thing that makes your spirits perform better. Most equipment, when your minion dies, it drops the equipment, and then your opponent can pick it up. The drawback that it returns to your hand is actually a benefit. It goes really well with all of your spirits and also with Tawny. I should mention the avatar is the Druid. Part of the reason that I chose the Druid is because every time you place a site, you get a 1-power flyer. This synergizes really well with Torhammer Trinket. I also have a couple of other artifacts, Amethyst Core to provide a little bit of acceleration, which is useful against aggressive decks. I have the Cathera mechanism, which is part of some combos. Then I have Ring of Morrigan, which synergizes very well with Torhammer Trinket and Evil Presence because they're cards that return to your hand and you get to cast them over and over. Almost anything that gains life is key in this game. And Air has Highland Princess to tutor for it, and this deck also has Dream Quest to tutor for it. One of the really cool synergies is that Tawny is a spellcaster, and Dream Quest can be cast on Tawny. Early in the game, you can Dream Quest for anything, and it's pretty reliable because it's hard to kill Tawny on turn 1. Later in the game, if you Dream Quest Tawny, you really want to park her somewhere out of the way. At worst case, your opponent trades a removal spell for the Dream Quest and you lose Tawny, but the upside of being able to tutor for whatever you want is very high. I think the spiciest card in the deck is 13 Treasures of Britain. It's a card that I fell in love with the first weekend I played with it. I used to be playing a Death Speaker deck, and I had a Nimbus Jinn combo finish, and I wanted a way to get more cards into my hands. 13 Treasures looked like a way to do that. What I noticed is that it was fairly symmetrical, and sometimes it gave my opponent more help than it gave me, but that a lot of cards were being drawn. And what it made me think about was, how can I get the most cards in an unfair way when this card is out? What I realized is that Air has a number of creatures with Void Walk, and the Evil Presence Spirits synergies allow you to summon something anywhere. And the Druid ability to tap and play Tawny could make a Owl Familiar, locations that are adjacent to your sites. Collectively, what that meant is no matter where 13 Treasures randomly lands after your minion picks it up and you get to draw a card, you have a very good chance of being the person who gets there next. 13 Treasures can draw a lot of cards, and the Cathera mechanism is a way to make it just totally go off in a very silly way. Over the weekend, there was one game where I drew 20 cards over the course of the game. My opponent said that the only reason they didn't concede was because they wanted to see just how powerful it was. I'll talk about minions. I mentioned the Highland Princess. Recurring Spectre. This is an unexpected inclusion. In a lot of situations, it seemed underpowered, but the situations where it was the best card were usually against Archimago. The fact that we could trade a bunch of resources, they could kill all my other minions, but I had this card that I could keep playing, and with Evil Presence, it could have charge. With Torhammer trinkets, it could hit pretty hard. It meant that I could often just grind them out. Castle Haunt, Headless Haunt, Phantasmal Shade, all three of these creatures, they cost 3 mana, double air threshold, they have 4 power, they have a significant drawback. Part of the game is figuring out how to manage their drawbacks. Castle Haunt can be summoned anywhere with Evil Presence, but otherwise you're limited to only summoning it to their unique and elite sites. Phantasmal Shade is vulnerable to smaller creatures, so you have to figure out how to use your Recurring Specters or Tawnies or other minions to clear minions so that the Shade can keep cracking your opponent for 4. I've even had opponents have their avatar attack the Phantasmal Shade, taking 4 damage and losing the ability to play or draw a site in order to get rid of it. Positioning it away from your opponent's avatar can also be an important mitigation strategy. Headless Haunt is pretty random. Obviously, you can play the Cathera mechanism, and you can use Blink to moderate where it lands. Thinking about it as, I will summon this thing in the void, and at some point it will appear somewhere useful and do some damage, is how I think about it. Phase Assassin also costs 3, and the ability to summon in the void, and it has stealth, and sometimes moving it back into the void to give it evasion again is really good. And the nice thing about all 12 of these 3 mana creatures is that if on turn 1 you play an air site, and then turn 2 you play a tower that gives you extra mana, you can cast any of them on turn 2. This can provide a huge amount of pressure and tempo in your favor, and can often put opponents on the back foot. There are a lot of games where I ended at 20 life and my opponent was just struggling the entire game to handle the threat after threat that I kept on playing. Gyre Hippogriff, I think Flying in Charge is a great combo, and 4 mana is a little expensive, but this deck can afford it. I have 3 Daperyll Vampires. I think this is absolutely the most important card against aggressive decks. The nice thing about this deck is that it has enough big creatures earlier in the mana curve that they'll often spend their removal resources handling those, and then when I follow up with a vampire, they don't have a good answer for it. There are a few important things about playing the vampire. One is you don't want to play it adjacent to your opponent's sites if they're playing fire, because then they can play cards like Violent and deal damage directly to the vampire. If you can avoid it, you also don't want to block on their turn, because the vampire will then have damage stacked on it, and then if they spend another effect, they can kill it. My preference, if I can afford the risk, is to only have the vampire attack on my turn, so that my opponent doesn't have the ability to stack on extra damage against the vampire to finish it off. I have 2 copies of Grandmaster Wizard. Initially, I thought this was too high on my curve, but there are enough matches, like against Avatar of Earth or Archimago, where the match comes down to attrition, and the ability to draw 3 cards is just fantastic. I think if you're playing air, it would be really strange not to play Grandmaster Wizard. 2 copies of Nimbus Jinn. This is my quick combo finish where you have an Evil Presence down, or you have 8 mana and you cast Evil Presence and then Jinn. And the Jinn comes in, can attack for 4, and then you can drop cards for 3 apiece. just closes out games very quickly. And even if your opponent is at 20, you can knock them down to 16 and then drop 6 cards. And the Evil Presence can be one of the cards that you drop. This is how I won both of my games in the finals against the Archimago player. It's one of those things where people have to plan their entire game around the possibility that you have this, or risk getting blown out. Moving on to Magic, I have 2 copies of Arcane Barrage. This card has been really great for me. I find that against Archimago, it's my second most common finisher, especially when they cast Orb, and then I get to cast Arcane Barrage for double my mana. Tawny being able to cast it from anywhere is also a really useful tactical piece. Early game, it can be direct removal against decks with smaller minions. Sometimes you can kill 2 things. I've been very impressed with the flexibility of the card. In the early days of Magic, cards with an X casting cost were always strong. 1 copy of Browse. Getting a look at 7 cards is for 1 mana is about as good as it gets, and I'm pretty stoked every time I see it. I mentioned Dream Quest. The thing to keep in mind is that even if you've flipped your Druid, Grandmaster Wizard is also a legit target for Dream Quest. Worst comes to worst, it's just a card that you can discard to Nimbus Jinn. 4 copies of Blink. I've long thought that if you're in air, you have to have a really good reason not to play 4 copies of Blink. I think knowing where you want your avatar to be is one of the most important skills for each matchup. Against an avatar of Earth, sometimes you want to hold on to your blinks because you want to be able to get out of the way of a Pudge Butcher. Grapple Shot, one of the best cards in the game, is just a removal spell. If you can synergize it with Daperyll Vampire, it can be a backbreaking amount of life gain against an aggro deck. The other thing to keep in mind is sometimes it's just a super mobility spell. I've had a Death's Door situation where my opponent was in the far corner, I was in my starting space, they had a Root Spider under them, but because I was able to use Grapple Shot to target my own Tawny, my Druid was able to move across the board, and then I could tap and move over, and I was flipped, so then my opponent was trapped, and then I could, the next turn, walk over and finish them off. Yeah, super versatile, I love it. Whirling Blades is the same. Slightly more expensive, could be total blowouts. The number of times where it's a 2-for-1 and I damage my opponent, or even worse for them, I have a Daperyll Vampire and I sweep their board and go back up to 20. Just brutal. Part of the reason that I've chosen to play the Druid, I've talked a little bit about the benefit of the Tawny side, but the Bruin side both protects you from Death's Door situations, which is amazing. But Grapple Shot and Whirling Blades are cards where if you get a really unlucky draw and you don't get enough minions, you could have a very awkward hand. And always keep in mind that you can flip your Druid over and use the Bruin to Grapple Shot or Whirling Blades. I'll move on to the sites. 3 each of Dark Tower, Lone Tower, and Gothic Tower. My experience is if I played 4 of it, I was pretty likely to draw 2 in the same game, and that's not useful. But having 9 of them total, very likely to have one by turn 2, especially I'll tend to mulligan hands that don't have at least 1 tower because I want that explosive turn 2 aggressive spirit play. 3 copies of Beacon. It's like a tower. It doesn't always work, but against a player who's being aggressive against you, it can give you 1 or 2 extra mana and get that Daperyll Vampire out just that much earlier. 3 copies of Free City, 3 copies of Mountain Pass, and 2 copies of Perilous Bridge. Even though most aggressive decks have ways to bypass a defensive site played forward, sometimes they don't have it, and these cards can shut them down for 2 to 4 turns as they try and play sites to move around. If you have a second one of them, it's even worse for them. I really like the defensive sites. 2 copies of Imperial Road. This is another way to ramp sites out. You do sometimes need to draw an extra site to make the Imperial Road work out. But against a deck that you want early conflict with, sometimes Imperial Roading even on turn 1, so that they now have a site that's super forward and exposed, can be a strong play, because you're going to have Tawny right away able to get up in their face. 2 copies of Sinkhole. Some of the decks in the format, like Geomancer and Archimago, are super mana hungry and want to craterize you. Sinkhole can knock them back a turn. Many Archimago builds have greedy mana bases, and you can knock down their Earth Threshold to make the game more difficult for them. If they have a defensive site or a Pebbled Paths, you can blow those up. Super versatile. Essentially think that every deck in Sorcery should probably be playing Sinkhole. 3 Watchtowers, there's still plenty of infiltrates out there. You can either blank their card, or if you hold the Watchtower, they'll commit the time and resources to cast the spell, and then you can get your minion back. Wizard's Den is maybe my favorite site from Arthurian Legends. If you're not a Source or an Archimago, every card that you can get is a premium. So a site that draws you cards is awesome. Sometimes I get to live the dream of not casting my recurring Spectre, or someone going through the work to hit the Wizard's Den, and then getting to discard recurring Spectre. Those are all the cards. I would say that the deck is an aggro combo deck. What that means is you play the deck like an aggressive deck at the beginning. I'll mulligan away extra removal spells to look for early threats. And then sometimes you just win on sheer aggression. But for decks that are very controlling or can stabilize, you also have the ability to win out of the blue. The 2 main combos are assembling 13 treasures with Kytheria Mechanism to draw an arbitrarily large number of cards, and assembling a Nimbus Jinn plus Evil Presence to be able to summon the Nimbus Jinn over where your opponent is. Though you can also just grind them on Attrition with recurring Spectres and having more card draw. I've had plenty of games with Archimago where they actually ran out of spells. They used everything in their graveyard, they used everything they drew, and I still had stuff and they didn't. Against aggressive decks, I think that you play more of a controlling or mid-range role. You're going to be a little slower than them, you're going to play a bunch of things that are bigger than them. You have a lot of ways to gain life, prioritize gaining life. You're just supposed to stabilize, and then you can pivot pretty fast. You have really strong aggression. If you've stabilized, your bigger things and larger resources will take over the game. My last tip is, like, when is it right to play Bruin? I think the answer is most often the turn that you hit Death's Door. They often burn a lot of their resources pushing to get there, and then now they have to figure out another answer to Bruin. If you're playing against a flame color and your life total is very high, and they're gonna projectile you for 20, flip Bruin over. Now they have to figure out how to deal with Bruin, or they can't really make good use of their flame color ability until they do. If your opponent is aggressive and you have an awkward hand, there's nothing wrong with getting Bruin early as a blocker. He'll probably die, but he'll probably buy you a significant amount of life. That's the video. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. If you like my videos, subscribe. I don't make them that often, but I think I make good videos when I do. Have fun.